magazine. Just one item of business, the restrooms, if you're looking for them, are just over there. So you go out the doors and go to the end of this hall, so just down there. First of all, thank you to Amber, Catherine, George, Christy, and Alex for organizing the summit that was before this event and for this event itself. I just want to say a few words about Damage Magazine. We have been around since 2018 as an online publication, but about a year ago, a little more than a year ago, we started publishing print issues. There are print issues available for sale right back there. Please do pick them up. This is issue number 1. It's called Building Big Things. It was our first print issue. It features an article from Amber Ali Frost on the left's destructive fantasies, from Dustin Guastella right here on why manufacturing matters, and from Sam Chris on Saudi megastructures. This is the first issue. The second issue is on the theme of deinstitutionalization. It also features Dustin on the failure of harm reduction in Philadelphia and beyond, Catherine Liu on the cultural studies revolution in academia, myself on the future of Odd Fellowship in America. So pick that up as well. And then finally, the issue that we're here to celebrate tonight, issue number 3, Mothers, featuring an article from Dustin on progress in the family, which we're going to talk about in a bit. Amber Ali Frost on the trad wife landscape, Jen Pan on the retrospective on the Barbara Ehrenreich book, which is Midwives and Nurses, and C.K. Rawlings on daycare politics. So that is also available right there for pickup. So I'll turn it over to our speakers, Catherine Liu and Dustin Guastella. Let me just get the official bios. Catherine Liu is a professor of film and media studies at UC Irvine. She is the author of Virtue Hoarders, The Case Against the Professional Managerial Class, and is at work on Traumatized, forthcoming from Verso. Dustin Guastella is Director of Operations for Teamsters Local 623 and an Associate Researcher at the Center for Working Class Politics. And they are here to talk to us about building an anti-fascist Democratic Party. I'm just kidding. We don't care about politics or damage. We care about mothers instead. So I'll turn it over to Catherine and Dustin.
Thank you, Ben. That was a great, if slightly misleading introduction about what we're going to be talking about. But I'm going to lead off with a question for Dustin about his article. I'm imagining that most of you haven't had a chance to read it yet, so it's a kind of crazy question. And he's going to defend his pro-family socialist stance. So, Dustin, what are some of the anti or non-market values that the family can still transmit? Families have been said by its critics to be places of regression and narcissism, sites of credit making, financial investment, and repression and authoritarianism. But what does the atomized individual represent outside of the family beyond self-optimization and self-realization as the embodiment of rational self-interest? How can we still instill the need for a progressive superego in infantilized subjects in our asocial times? I think the thing that Freud allowed us to celebrate and fear was the polymorphous perversity of the infant. It seems, however, that Sam Bankman-Fried and the Gen Z edgelords wanted to rationalize and instrumentalize polymorphous perversity as a polyamorous lifestyle. Perpetual childhood, perpetual experimentation, no limits, no rejection, no pain, no sacrifice. How can we talk about the idea for needs of love that entail a social ideal of the importance of sacrifice, mutual respect, in creating trust in all our institutions as real leftists, not liberal leftists? Sorry for the long question, but now go.
Well, that was probably 5 questions. And one of them was about the superego in Freud, which I have no way of responding. No, so I think to your larger point, the question is sort of whether or not the family is a conservative institution or whether or not it's something broader than that, a social institution. And the point of writing this article and thinking about this is to think about ways in which the family is a common good. That is, it's not a public good like a school or social health care or something like that, but it is a common good in which the virtues of sort of selflessness, discipline, self-discipline, and love and companionship are reared. And it's one of the few institutions still around where these are the guiding principles of family life, right? They are not market principles, they are not transactional principles. And I think one of the mistakes the left has made, or not necessarily consciously, but one of the traps the left has fallen into, is to see conservative valorization of the family as a reason why the left should be sort of skeptical or opposed to family life as a common good, right? And so this makes sense to a certain degree, right? I think Thatcher and Reagan effectively said we're going to downsize the state and offload state responsibilities into the private family, right? We're going to say the family is going to take care of all these different things. And in response to that, I think many on the left have said, well, that must mean that the family itself is irredeemably conservative, it's a backward institution, it's an institution that sort of bolsters the neoliberal state, right? It bolsters the marketization of everything. And my argument is, no, that's not quite right. And I think what we've seen is the disillusion of family life over the entire period of neoliberalism to create extremely atomized individuals who do not see the family as a site of basically social virtue and see it instead as a site of conservatism. And so what non-market virtues does the family provide? Well, for one, it's the first organic form of solidarity that we encounter, right? When you're helping your brothers and sisters and when you're dealing with your parents, these are behaviors that are not based on transaction, they're not based on competition, they're based on caregiving, right? Mutual caregiving, ideally, right. But they have to be, right? There's a dependence that family life requires that means you have to figure out how to live together. And it's no coincidence why the union movement, people call each other brother and sister, right? They don't call each other some market transactional relation. They don't call each other my customer, or they don't call each other my partner, right? They call each other brother or sister, right? There's the reason that family bond is so significant, and the reason that so many trade unionists across the entire world consistently use that language is because there's something about the companionship and solidarity that family life mimics that they see in the union movement. And so the argument is basically like, let's not give the family to the right. We need to create a society in which not only the state can support the growth of healthy and happy families, but also ideologically we affirm that this is a common good. This is something that we believe is in fact good for the society. And more and stronger families are a way forward for us to have a better social life.
Great. You were going to ask me.
So, well, one thing I wanted to ask you was, you had written a really provocative article, I think, that probably didn't get a lot of play about Confucian versus Christian family values. And so, from my background, I mean, I'm a cradle Catholic, so most of what I write about in terms of family life comes out of a Christian understanding of family life. So for you, I want to know, like, why do you see the Confucian side so different from the Christian side?
It is very different, but there are certain structures there that lend itself to a political understanding, because the Confucian family was always the smallest unit of the state. And if the father was a good father, the father was worthy to rule. His authority was worthy to rule. So it was a more rational, anti-tyrannical, and sort of Chinese, East Asian progressive model. It wasn't about promoting authoritarianism for authoritarianism's sake. However, in its actuality, the demands of filial piety are extraordinarily repressive. The thing that I thought was interesting about what is renounced with regard to the monotheisms is actually a kind of transactional pragmatism, Confucianism. You keep the family together because it is about keeping, because China was mostly a peasant economy, you keep the land together. And primogeniture was very important. But one of the things that I found, like working between China and the US, was that, not my family completely crazy, but was that under Confucianism, there's a deep, very clearly demarcated set of roles and rules for people that come out of the family. So there's, you respect your elders, you know your role, and primogeniture is, of course, very important, which means, though, that the eldest, has to take enormous amounts of responsibility. And what I've seen in the United States with this kind of infantilizing consumer culture, that is also, part of East Asia now, is that there's actually a complete lack of respect on the left that's celebrated. Like, we just are, disrespectful. Like, I'll just do anything I want, and that's just me. Like, I can't really handle you. I'm kind of making fun of younger people, but I'm sorry about that. And I was and this goes into the question of the other question you wanted to ask me about athleisure.
Yeah.
And there's this question.
Wait, let me ask it.
Wait.
Can I ask it?
Oh, okay, fine.
Why do you hate athleisure?
Why do I hate athleisure? It's the end of civilization. I think there's something valuable about respecting the limits and the formality of interactions with other people. And maybe this gets to the Catholicism in which you were reared. But what I was going to say about clear boundaries and respect for roles in life, including dressing like an adult in public, which fewer and fewer young people do, is that within those frames of roles and hierarchies, you can actually criticize authority from a grounded place. And I find that there's this, because of internet culture and whatever Joshua has explored more deeply, there's this culture of fake assent in America. And we think of a Chinese repressive Confucian culture as being much more repressive and authoritarian, at least that's what the propagandists will tell you. But within the limits of a very hierarchical society, you can criticize the authorities for failing to perform their role. And this is, in a way, how the Communist Party rules. They're terrified of not doing their jobs well because they will be thrown out. When a father loses his authority, he mismanages the family. He mismanages the family goods. And I think that that's built into the Confucian family, built into the psychology of that family. And there is actually a kind of, I'm sorry to say this, within monotheism, a kind of irrational submission to authority. God the Father, he's correct in all accounts. I'm caricaturing it a little bit. But I found that if you have very clearly demarcated roles, you can actually find more solidarity and go up and dissent and criticize people more deeply. When you have this fake horizontality, this fear of losing your wages, losing your income, you have this culture which we live in now of fake assent, fake agreement with everything. You talk to students now who are in crits, a lot of you are art students, or some of you are graduate students. The fear of actually criticizing someone's work, disagreeing with someone, is partially due to this lack of formal boundaries. And I think that that's why people like Jordan Peterson were so popular with young men, or even Joe Rogan, because he tells you how to lift weights. But they're telling young men that you can't just be an amorphous blob in front of a screen. You have to respect certain rules. I mean, they may be the wrong rules of engagement, but there's a whole thing in Western culture, and this is Christian. Sorry, this is such a long answer. But in courtly love, that the role between the sexes is that the rules of seduction have rules, and you don't just show everything and give everything, and that not everything it's actually not safe to show everything and give everything, and there's certain rules and protocols that we have to agree on as human beings in civilization. And that's why I think if you wear athleisure in public, you are promoting the end of civilization.
No, I mean, a lot of what you hit on there, especially the points of the difficulties of actually engaging in organized protest without a foundation for, what I would say is a foundation for social organization. The dissolution of the family in the West coincides with the dissolution of trade unions. It coincides with the dissolution of associations. It coincides with the emptying of the pews, the de-churchification of American culture. Now, each of these things on their own has goods and bads, right? But they are all social institutions that have been eradicated, right? We've seen over the course of the last 50 years the dissolution of social organization. fundamentally, right? One of the most important facts to understand about our contemporary society is that people do not and are not part of associations and organizations, right? The family is one of those. And what those things do, both the family and the associations, is they train you on how to live a social life, a properly social life, right? And the fake horizontality that you're talking about is how to live an atomized life. If I don't like something, I opt out. If I don't want to do something, I leave. I protest it because I don't like it. But why is it that the left in the United States, since at least the 1960s, has such a hard time figuring out how to make any organization whatsoever work? And part of it is a lack of sociality in the understanding of what associationalism is. The family is one kernel of that associationalism, right? It's one thing that teaches you the give and take, the companionship, the sacrifice, and the caregiving that family life requires, teaches you to do those things. And it teaches you, good families teach you how to do it well, and they teach you how to sort of live in that environment and build those kind of organizations.
Well, so one of the things that I think the anti-family people always neglect to say is that in the history of media in 20th century America, the position of the father was always a joke. So this anti-patriarchal attitude was in consumer society immediately the moment credit became a thing in the 20s and the moment that women were able to enter the workforce, even at very low levels, and the domestic sphere became a sphere of consumption. So that in the 50s, there was a privileging of the female member of the household who chose to buy everything, and then there was dad, who was always like a bumbling fool. So this was the patriarchy that Betty Friedan and second wave feminists had to, were criticizing. It was an institution already falling apart. One of the things that I think the father does psychoanalytically is say no. And American parents have a really hard time, especially professional managerial class parents, because of attachment parenting and all this like progressive education. They have a really hard time saying a hard no. There's certain things in life, like incest, where it is really a hard no. And then we made a hard no, guys, except for Game of Thrones. Which is so you have this kind of like civilizational breakdown. But one thing that I think is really terrifying to me is to see the attitude of young people today with regard to the past. And I think the family can be assimilated to this past. And the past, for so many people, that started my generation, is sort of post-68. The past is the site of just idiocy, racism, slave-owning, patriarchy, homophobia, all of these psychological pathologies that we in the present allegedly are free from. And I think that people who want to abolish the family and create this like voluntaristic collectivism that so often doesn't work out have this kind of lack of humility and respect with regard to the anthropological, historical, cultural institutions that make us human. There's a leftism that loves transhumanism. I heard something recently about hydrofeminism, where we're all supposed to be like water. There's an anti-humanism in the left, anti-family as well, anti-history that we need to purge ourselves of. And I think finally with the Trump election, we can free ourselves from the inhibitions that we've had before and just denounce this kind of left voluntarism, this vanguard desire to be like one or two people who understand something and then has to finger wag at everyone, like, hydrofeminism or water, be like water, something to be a rock. Or there's a listing of like rocks too, like young men are like identified with rocks, I don't know, women identified with water. It's you get into these terrible like anti-intellectual binaries, and it's all like pure will. Like I do this, I am better than this, I decolonize the curriculum. People don't even know what the curriculum is, but they think that it's time to decolonize it. And I'm really in despair because I do feel like capitalism will achieve the utter annihilation of the past if we let it.
Well, I think it already has. I mean, to a certain degree, many of the individuals you're talking about aren't wrong in that they are subjects of an era in which the past is intentionally considered to be, they're a site of no learning, no knowledge, or no redemption, And part of that is because there was a hard break, right? The 80s created this extremely hard break that said, all of that post-war stuff that we had going on, good, bad, and the ugly, is just completely behind us now. And we shall march forward now. Time starts now, and we're moving from here to a brighter and better future. And people on the left, as much as people on the right, bought into this, right? I think many people on the left, even though they protested Reagan and Thatcher, there was a morning in America on the left, right? They believed that the values of 68 are triumphing in the cultural sphere. They believed all of this. And to even consider going backward, to reconsider the values and the virtues of the mid-century would be a great sin against the cause of progress, right? And I don't buy that. I mean, I think that
there's a bad historicism that came out because of the new left, and Dustin and I totally agree on this, and second wave feminism, where we thought the 50s was a time of enormous backwardness. Actually, there was more labor unrest in the 50s. There was increase in African American wealth because all the social services lifted up African American conditions more than under Obama, where African American family assets fell by untold sums. And we had to think of it as being this backward time. It was a very contradictory time. It was a time when the GI Bill allowed working class men and women returning from the war to participate in higher education. The institutions of higher education expanded in untold ways, but there was some way in the 1960s where we had to renounce all of that and sort of dismiss the past as the time of the benighted. And I think that the 80s, what you said about the 80s was the realization of the 60s values, because all of those boomers, counterculturalists, they entered the institutions. But one of the things that I think they really don't like my colleagues who are on this side, they don't like the European Enlightenment, because the European Enlightenment is white, it's male, it's the beginning of the scientific method, we have to constantly find other forms of enlightenment, it's not the form of reason that we should abide by. But their own rationalization of their position is a pure enlightenment position. Like, we see better, we know better, we've achieved better. And this is what I mean by this lack of public humility about the struggle for human emancipation that actually begins at that time, and that this legacy should be all our legacies. It wasn't just the American and the French revolutions, it was the Haitian Revolution. The idea that all human beings were created equal as a public idea, despite all the flaws and the madness of those times, is something that is part of our cultural heritage now. And I'm sorry to say that it happened in Europe, and and Europe was colonizing people at the time. And the scientific method, the reason why we have straight lines on the floor, we have heating, we have a toilet that you can flush that goes into a major infrastructure system, sewage system. All of these are Enlightenment projects that created the sanitary conditions by which smaller nuclear families can exist, and by which women no longer have to have 11 children so that 2 survive. And I feel like there's like a left reaffirmation of the Enlightenment narrative that we need to return to now, because the radical dismissal of these civilizational achievements and the struggle for freedom, and the world gave us marks because of the Industrial Revolution, those are things that we have to defend now from the left, because no one else is going to defend them.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think to your point about progress and its coincidence with a number of things that we now take for granted, this is also true with the basic family structure, right? The left imagines that, and the right imagines this as well, that family life exists in basically a downward curve since the beginning of modernity, right? Like, mass literacy happens, and then everybody just stops having kids and stops having families, and it's just one downward curve from there, right? This is not true, right? Family life in modern history looks like this. And it looks like this for a reason. It wasn't until the miracles of modern science that made it so that children survived childbirth, and mothers survived childbirth, and mothers survived long enough to see their children have children, that we get large families, right? Ireland, in the turn of the century, was one of the highest out-of-wedlock countries in the world. It had one of the lowest birth rates in the world. Now, Americans have this tremendous prejudice against the Irish, where we think that they're all people who have 57 kids and 587 cousins. That did not happen until Ireland had a genuine industrial change. It didn't happen until there was stable income and decent medical facilities to make it possible for people to enjoy family life. And so progress, the long arc of historical progress, was for a very long time completely coincident with the rise of stable families. And then we hit that great inflection point in the middle 60s through the 80s where it stalls. And since then, we've been on the downturn. We've been on the downturn in unionization, we've been on the downturn in family life, we've been on the downturn in associationalism, and of course, we've been on the downturn in terms of a political culture that actually confronts the big questions that we need to confront if we're going to create a society that is more social, more humane, more equal, and better for ordinary people to live. There's not a coincidence that these things all follow the same curve. We can't just imagine that it's, in fact, a weird blip of history that all this stuff follows one curve. There was an arc of progress, and we are on, unfortunately, the downswing side of it.
And I think that my disillusionment with second wave feminism came slowly but in a long time, over a long period of time. But I think Dorothy Sue Cobble, who's a labor historian of feminism, stated it best in her collection on the other women's movement. She said that the labor socialist movement for women always fought for universal workers' rights and the raising of the minimum wage. But second wave feminism, who are college-educated women or PMC women, they could not focus on universal programs or minimum wage because what they focused on was equity in the white-collar workplace. And that improved their lot. It was self-interest. That improved their lot, like breaking the glass ceiling, Sheryl Sandberg, Madeleine Albright, all those, Hillary Clinton, Kamala Harris among them, that what they wanted was to be able to compete with men on an equal footing in high-level elite professional spaces. What the labor and social feminists, whose names have now been forgotten because of McCarthyism and also the triumph of second-wave feminism, they were always interested in bread and butter issues. And it's shown that in sociological studies that universal health care and the raising of the minimum wage improves the material conditions for masses of women, not just the minority of women, 25% of women who go to elite schools and want to compete with the 25% of men who go to elite schools. And one of the things that the depoliticization of feminism produced was a culture of awareness. Like, we have to be aware of breast cancer. It's Prostate Cancer Awareness Month. There's no kind of that should have been funny, but nobody. There's no material redistribution. It's all about awareness of inequity, awareness of even violence against women. The Violence Against Women Act was about awareness and prevention rather than redistribution. And in the researching this book on Traumatized, this language of awareness and prevention was captured by second wave feminism to produce political change at the elite levels so that no economic structures had to be modified.
Yeah, I think the class project of the second wave feminists was pretty clear, and it's showing itself now even more clearly in the fact that we're still saying, I think many people are still saying, that the problem is the patriarchy, the problem is this and that, when women are now overrepresented in universities, when women are now making a lot more money than many of their male peers. And I think that's a huge problem for second wave feminists to confront, because it suggests that some women have done tremendously well. But as you said, the vast majority of women are working class women who've done not so well under this.
And all the statistics have shown that college-educated women, the rate of divorce for college-educated women is on a delta to 0. And for non-college-educated women, they're having more children out of wedlock, their marriages end in divorce, extremely destabilized lives. So it's like elite women are abolishing the family when capitalism has abolished the family for working class women.
Yeah, and this brings up another issue about many people on the left who are unaware of their own class position, not preaching what they practice, right? There's for me, a stable family life, a good marriage, and not getting divorced is really important for me, but not as a value socially, not as a value that I would ever say should be something that socially. So if we look at divorce statistics, or if we look at single motherhood, we shouldn't think of those things as necessarily negative, right? Like why should we say that America leading the world in single motherhood is a bad thing? All these women are just making empowered choices, right? No, obviously the reason they're single mothers is because the social world has left them behind and cut them adrift, and they're struggling, and it's very difficult. But instead of being able to say that, we have to insist that no, despite the fact that elite women practice extremely traditionalist bourgeois norms, they preach the disillusion as if it's empowerment, as if it's a good thing. And this, to me, is, I think, the crux of the class argument for this stuff being a class argument for justifying the disillusion of working class life and saying it's in fact a good thing that working class life is falling to bits and pieces.
So in a way, I'm going to push back and say that one of the reasons why upper middle class families stay together is because they have so much to lose in terms of asset accumulation and the tax structure. So there is some kind of transactional pragmatism that does keep them together as well. Because it's the loss of wealth for women and for men after divorce, more wealthy, is enormous. But in terms of working class people, there's very little incentive to stay together if something does go wrong.
Of course, yeah.
Okay. Have we done our bit?
I think we
I'm going to open the floor to questions. I'll moderate. You can say your question from wherever you are, and I'm going to repeat it because this is being recorded for the BungaCast podcast. So if you don't, I will. If you hear me repeating a question, that's why I'm doing it. 1, 2. So yes, and then you say.
So I'm thinking about this idea about the 80s being this turning point, and in children's mental health, it was a big turning point too. You went from having these like child guidance clinics that came up in the post-war period to all the funding going to child protection and to child removal.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there today. So the 80s were an inflection point in child mental health care, and resources went
from child guidance clinics to child removal and child protection.
From child guidance clinics to child removal.
And I'm curious, when you picture better family supports, what do each of you picture as kind of appropriate state intervention when things aren't going well enough?
So what do you envision as state intervention when things aren't going well enough?
Oh, I wish I had an answer for that. I mean, that's a tough question. I don't know. I mean, for me, I think the main argument we need to make is to say, whether or not we think keeping families together is a virtue, right? Mm. And if we do think that, then I think these things have to follow from that, and we have to think through the specifics of policy after that. But if we don't think keeping families together is a virtue, then that has very different spin-offs, right?
I think that very objectively speaking, one of the ways in which women and children remain in abusive relationships is the non-portability of healthcare. And so if we had universal single-payer healthcare with adequate mental health coverage, which we don't have now, the likelihood of mothers removing themselves from abusive situations with their children would be much greater. Now, whether or not you want to have a state support intervene there, I don't know. But I like to think of Red Vienna, the entire complex outside of Vienna where you have housing, you have social services, small scale, building-based even, so that you have informal forms of surveillance and support that are supported by the rents within the big building complex that is Karl Marxhof outside of Vienna. That seems to work well. One of the problems is that when you have child removal services happening in the 80s, you also have cuts in all the federal agencies. So you have social workers who are completely overworked, burnt out, underfunded, who have new burdens. And this was like the great irony of the removal and deinstitutionalization is we cut all the institutions where we might have kept children in a well-funded, state-run institution. We cut the social services, and then we have all this violence awareness, mental health awareness initiatives from the government that I think created the trillion-dollar industry of self-help that we see today. Okay, so
well, I wanted to get I want you to comment on the nuclear family and the queer family. These are terms that are not in the mix, and it seems like family here is doing a lot of work without being specified. I mean, it seems like you're overlaying two things, which is like organized solidarity as a form of life, and then this question of the family. And I guess as a leftist, I would think that you kind of want to transcend that binary, really, so as to avoid it playing into some kind of weird culture war thing. Like, there are all kinds of reasons people would opt out of, like, the family as they experience it, just all kinds of, like, very good leftist reasons. And I feel like it's painting with a really broad brush to say all of that is this some kind of, like, elite abstraction. And there is certainly a very bourgeois kind of like silly polyamory, and then there's just the reality that people get paid less and need more incomes, and people are thinking it's just like, look, I'm gonna need a whole household of people to take care of if I want to have a kid. I mean, those are different.
You mean to
different
pay the
things.
rent?
And I'd like a little to specify a little bit further.
Is that what? So it's transactional. The polycule is transactional.
Or it's just that people the warmth of solid. It's exactly what you're talking about. That there is something to having like a larger number of people in solidarity helping each other out.
No, I think that's all totally valid, but I think we don't have to do a ton of work here, right? If you ask the vast majority of people what they want out of their adulthood, they will say, they would like a partner and they would like kids, right? The barriers for them to have those things are social and economic, primarily, right? The economic barriers are obvious, you listed them. Wages are not keeping up with either productivity, inflation, or housing costs, which make it very difficult to have a family. And socially, on a more deeper level, our society is organized to be atomistic. It is organized to be individualistic. And so what I want, and I am painting with a broad brush because I think the big concept needs to be defended, which is to say that people raising children, right? You might sneer and call it the nuclear family, but it may be a multi-generational family, right?
Could be a queer family.
Could be a queer family. People raising children in a cohesive unit is a good thing. And I think it's a good thing socially in the sense that we know that the statistics are ample, that these are the institutions in which the least amount of abuse occurs. These are the institutions in which the best child outcomes happen. It's pretty obvious that regular old boring families are pretty good for kids. And they're pretty good for parents too, right? Parents say that all the time. Parents say one of the most important things in their life is being a parent. Now, either all those people are lying and the kids are lying, or there's something to it that we have to actually think about and take seriously. I think for many people on the left, the knee-jerk reaction is family bad, family's negative, backward, bad. Maybe we should rethink that. Maybe we should think families are good. Maybe they are good.
In all different structures,
Yeah.
extended, queer, co-parenting. I make fun of the polycule thing because I'm old enough to remember that we used to just call it fucking around. So I don't get that. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, one all the way in the back. And I'm going to repeat your question because you in the cap. Yep.
So in other contexts, we've spoken about the distinction between like a pastoralist fantasy of communal living and an industrial fantasy of communal living.
Okay, so we've spoken about a pastoralist idea of communal living and a
Industrial fantasy.
industrial fantasy.
And
Okay.
it seems like the industrial age fantasy of family is very much like single income household, substantial social support, like in the 50s as you were discussing. So what is your fantasy, I guess, of a family unit in a post-industrial landscape that avoids cruel optimism, and how does it differ from what like young Catholics outside of DC are doing now?
Okay, wait. So what is your idea, fantasy of a post-industrial nuclear family? Because we had this idea of the nuclear family, very top-down. And how is that different from Catholic families outside of the DC area?
So there's a recent New York article that sort of like profiled all of these families and communal units, like very much along the lines of what you're talking about. So like, I'm just curious, like, how do you differentiate what we're talking about here from like a more traditional, like right-wing fantasy of family and of community around religion?
Well, the last part of that I'll say is that I think that families need to be egalitarian, first and foremost, right? I think the idea of the paterfamilias where the dad works and doesn't take care of his kids and kind of does his own thing, it's obviously not the right way forward. Parents need to co-parent. There needs to be actual involvement from both parents. But to the point about post-industrialization, my fantasy is to move beyond post-industrialization. I would like to re-industrialize the United States. One of my most important feelings is one of the reasons we have such social disillusion is because we destroyed our industrial base in this country. And so my fantasy is, in fact, a massive industrial policy to rebuild the roads, bridges, the New York City subway, which is why I was so late today, to rebuild all of these things. And to rebuild these things, you need steel, you need cement, and you need a lot of money to be pumped into the working class. Because who's going to build this stuff? It's not going to be robots. It's not going to be Tesla. It's not going to be Musk. It's going to be a lot of workers. So my fantasy is not, let's rebuild the family in a post-industrial landscape. My fantasy is, if we rebuild the industry, we can rebuild families. And I think that way of thinking about it, we will actually have all of the social knowledge and experience of modernity behind us to understand the ways in which families can be good and better and equal, because we've lived through that. You know, the people who you're talking about, this sort of ultra right-wing Catholics who are trying to go back to this fantasy of this hardcore patriarchal society, they are the ones that have a much harder time, because they have to fight against the historical knowledge of what life has brought us, what modern life has brought us. We have an easy time. What we have to do is rebuild society. So I think the way that we think about it is to say, what comes first? Well, what comes first is reindustrializing the United States, and in that, I think we will get better, stronger, and more families.
Okay, I forgot who was two. Oh, yes, you are two. Yes, you. Yes.
I'm not asking this to be facetious, but I am very serious when I ask, how much of a problem is this for the politics on the left? Maybe I've just opted out of the weirdos
how
on the
much
left
of a
and
problem
am not
is this on the
familiar
left?
with these arguments, but I didn't see that as like a point of contention in the election, in the politics of the election. And I think most people who would identify as, you know, being sympathetic with leftist ideas, but wouldn't call themselves the leftists, you know, because they're not that politically engaged on the left, like, they would agree with much of the criticism about families as a site of repression, given the opening of the family to like the vagaries of the market. But they would stop short of saying, let's abolish the family. And I think obviously that's where the weirdos on the left lose the majority. But like, how much is that like small faction of the left really making headway into politics?
Great question. I'm going to summarize it. She's not asking this to be facetious, but she really wants to know how much of a problem really is this anti-family left, because she thinks they're just a very small faction. And most ordinary people not that involved in politics who might be sympathetic to the left would be sympathetic to your ideas.
Yeah, I think that's right, Carissa. I think that to a certain extent, this seems like a small problem. But as we've seen on the left, small problems can become very big problems very quickly. And the reason that is because the left has most of its social power in what? The media. And so I think if there's no one out there saying, wait, let's pump the brakes on immediately reacting against pro-family talk with anti-family talk, which seems to be the kind of reactive way much of the left-wing discussion happens. If we don't have a proactive argument for why families are good, then the weakest arguments for why families are bad will win. And I think in the election, for instance, Vance was the guy who got to pretend to be the big family guy, right? He was the, I want to rebuild American families, right? If the debate is between J.D. Vance and a social democrat or a socialist, right? What is the socialist response to Vance? Is the socialist response, families don't matter, you're wrong to think that's the issue? Or is the socialist response, the way in which we build stronger and better families is through social interventions in the market and filling in the social life such that people want to and can achieve the family life that they desire?
I think on a deeper level, because I'm in academia, is that there's a kind of left knee-jerk reaction towards anything, to fetishize anything that's deviant and transgressive. And maybe you don't encounter this so much in your workplace, but a lot of crazy ideas hatched in hothouse environments of graduate seminars end up on the Democratic Party platform. And so,
in record time.
I hate that this happens, but it does. And you should, and graduate seminars increasingly are repressive places where conformity to this kind of idealization is demanded. So that, it doesn't seem that much of an issue from the outside. I think in activist circles, if you're just working with normal people,
Right.
but the thought leaders of the left liberal space is kind of crazy. Okay, what did I say? Okay, I said it was you, number 3 over here. Yes, and then 1, 2, 3. Yeah.
This is a psychoanalytic question, I think. Do you think that the figure of the sadistic mother is looming large, who wants you to be an undifferentiated baby, who doesn't develop their own ego and makes you wear out leisure?
I have so much to say about this. I have so much to say about this. Infanticide. So I don't know if it's a sadistic mother, but there definitely is, like the mother who reads too much and optimizes mothering, and that I've written about in Virtue Hoarders. But I really feel like there is a way in which, among certain liberal left elites, young men are being treated to a fantasy of castration that creates the gender divide. So all of your reactions are wrong. Everything you do is toxic. And then the Dems are like, oh my God, I can't believe what they didn't vote for us. They're like schooling. One of my colleagues came to a meeting, a faculty meeting, with toxic masculinity on her boobs. And I'm thinking, wow, that's really awesome to you. I don't know what that means. But there's also a way in which, and I'm going to write about this, where the working class is coded male now. And that erases working class women. And so the working class male has to be disciplined, and then any male libido, instead of being channeled into like a kind of tradition of courtly love where you treat women with respect and get something back from them, you have this total dismissal of any kind of masculinity without rules, so that you have the incel culture rising, the manosphere rising, which embodies this like hyper masculinity, because there is no socialized masculinity. And it was so important within the history of culture for men who return from war, or men who are used to just doing things with their bodies and dominating, to be sublimated, to have a path towards sublimation. And there's no path towards sublimation right now. I don't know if it's a sadistic mother or something, but there is no room for the unconscious either. It's like everything you say is what you mean, and then you must police it all.
Yeah.
And so there's this radical, intolerant tolerance that is maybe a maternalized superego, you could call it. I think it is a liberal superego, and I think that liberal superego is instantiated through all the institutions of learning from K to 12. I raised a son in this atmosphere, and I saw him become more and more alienated from progressive left liberal politics. I hope that's good answer. Yeah. One, two, three. Okay, yes.
Okay, so I agree that there is a lot of silly sloganeering around abolish the family, but I wonder if Sophie Lewis and Emmy O'Brien aren't just easy targets, when in fact there is a much older tradition stretching all the way from Plato and Campanella and utopian philosophical texts through Robert Owen and Charles Fourier, up through the writings of Marx and Engels themselves, and various others, beyond revolutionary Marxists, not just Alexander Kollontai, but Nikolai Bukharin, Trotsky, Preobrazhensky, various figures in Western Europe, Pennacook, Bordiga, who have written that eventually the functions of the family, the care functions and whatnot, just like the functions of the state, would eventually be socialized in the eventual transcendence of the institution of the family and the institution of the state. There are, of course, traditions that valorize the family form. Reformist social democracy, of course, you cited, I believe, and Stalinism, Trotsky's whole thing about Thermidor and the family, but also a very important strain of psychoanalytic Marxism, and something that's very dear to, I think, the writers and contributors to Damage Magazine is, of course, the Frankfurt School, very much inspired by Wilhelm Reich, Karl Korsch, who also talked about the abolition of the family, and of course, the very influential study of authority in the family in the 1930s. So I wonder how you'd respond to that older tradition. I know Horkheimer later changed his mind about the family after he was moving away from Marxism, and that's what Lash eventually picked up. But how do you respond to the older arguments about, like, the pre-68 stuff, like ignoring all the sort of culturalism that went along with that?
I mean, I think they responded to it, right? Marx and Engels, Engels' family, private property, and the state. There's a strong abolitionist sentiment in Engels' writing. Marx himself kind of doesn't like it and says he's uncomfortable with it. Later, the Social Democratic Party of Germany completely renounces it. We want nothing to do with abolishing the family, they say over and over and over again. I think many Marxists have said, well, no, they're just doing electoralism. What they're doing is just appeasing the boorish, backward proletarians, and really they still believe in abolishing the family, but I think there was a genuine change of heart, which was, maybe we were wrong about this. And the same thing happens later. Adorno himself says, maybe I'm wrong about this. Later changes his mind. Maybe it's not so cut and dry that the family needs to be or will be abolished. As far as Sophie Lewis and Emmy O'Brien and these people, I think they just got it wrong. I mean, I think that there is no socialization functions that can take over the role of basic family life. Like, I don't find it possible.
Maybe in the future, like, we don't put it out, it's not out of the question, but I think that one of the things that we've seen with regard to a strong, even a Stalinist state, is that there is a division of labor with regard to care that becomes very dangerous and repressive. And for now, what we have is a private space of non-transactional care that is remaining functional in a very hostile environment, hostile market environment. Maybe with a different political economic situation, the family can wither away. But I say to promote the abolition of the family, to produce that better world, is kind of putting the horse before the cart.
I would disagree with you there, Catherine. I think it's not just putting the horse before the cart. I don't think it's a valid goal. Like, I don't think there's a reason for us to say, actually, this is something we should be fighting for. Like, there's this strong feeling that, like, well, we should transcend the family. Why? I mean, and even when people say we're going to socialize functions of family life, well, to a certain extent, you're saying you're making family life less fun, because some of the parts that you want to socialize are the most fun parts, right? And if you say we're going to just, like, slowly pull away little bits of the family so that everybody, again, what does everybody end up? Even if it's a social atomization then, right? The state takes over roles of the family and we lose again.
Or a technological thing.
Or a technological.
Like Schulmith Firestone, for instance, in the dialectic of sex, promotes the idea that, motherhood enslaves women, and so we should technologize, childbirth. So there's this sort of utopian social horizon there to transcend the biological, which I think goes back to this kind of like facile left anti-humanism that is very chic in certain circles. So, yes.
Maybe a different way of asking the same question. I guess I'm still unclear on what the definition of the family is supposed to be in this conversation, and maybe if we get a clearer answer to that, does chosen family count? Is this just fundamentally about constructing a authority?
What is a chosen family in your view?
Friends.
Oh, friends, yeah.
I think cohabitating adults raising children.
Okay, so it's basically about having some sort of like egalitarian higher like authority structure that's taking care of kids.
Yes.
Okay, so.
And so you think that friends can replace the family? Is that what
I think sometimes they have to.
Yeah.
And I suppose the question is, if you can expand that to talk about multiple parents, can you expand the definition of the family such the question of whether or not it is going to be abolished even matters?
Can I ask you something, because I'm really interested in this? So you're talking about voluntaristic kinship relations. Like, there's some kinship relations that are not choices, and I have some really terrible ones, and I did not choose them.
Yeah.
And there is this utopic idea that you can choose your friends, you don't choose your family, and so that is this utopic horizon for a lot of young people who come from really difficult families. Mm-hmm. But in the end, there's something about the limits of choice that I think that Dustin and I agree on. Like, maybe he does this from a more religious point of view, I do this from a more ethical point of view. The idea that somehow choosing can sustain you is, I think, one of the illusions of left rationality. That you can rationalize intimate relations of kinship through voluntarism, it doesn't mean that you'll be happy with your family forever. It doesn't mean that your family will be nice to you. It doesn't mean that your family will understand you. It doesn't mean that you can express yourself with your family. But you're bonded by blood to certain people and have certain obligations to them that you may or may not want to respond to. This is what I mean. Like, it's an anthropological, biological, psychoanalytic view. Someone gave birth to you. That person is bonded to you by blood. You may hate her and never want to see her again, but that bond by blood will never. These are kinship relations you did not choose. So I think one of the great limitations that we've run up to in liberalism is this idea of choice. And that's why reproduction is framed as choice, and it's enormously neoliberal marketized. Like, the family is not a commodity. It's a burden. It's a legacy. It's an existential fact that we would all like to free ourselves from. So it's negative and positive. That's what I mean.
Yeah,
one, and then two, and then three.
I think that Justin's clarification that what you mean by family is really clarified as the raising of kids. I think that's very important because it's not, I think, just as Catherine says, a bond of the child to the parent, but it's also a bond of parents to their kids, which represents, in the way I understand it, a kind of path to the future, which is important as socialists, that we have like a envisionment of the future, that if that exceeds from view, then all we have is what's given to us, which is increasing barbarization. But I think that, as others have responded to, it's easy to fall into idealizations and just sort of oversimplifications of what childcare involves represent, and also in terms of your policy, it's not clear like what specifically you're advocating that we as socialists adopt, because and getting into the question of socialists advocating for certain kinds of virtues, there may be reason to be kind of minimal in our expectation of how much we can agree on what those specific virtues actually are. But I agree with your general sentiment. But would it not be maybe possible also to maybe make a rhetorical case that the focus on, say, family values is meaningful for us as socialists, because it would allow us to expand our base of people to include people that may not identify as socialists, but respond to the sorts of sentiments that we're getting at here.
Yeah, I think on a very basic, political electoral realm, that makes total sense. But I think why, and the reason I'm not saying here's a bunch of policies, we all know what good social democratic family policies are. They've been around for a very long time. The United States has none of them. Any one of them would go a long way to fixing some of our family troubles. And I'm talking, of course, of paid parental leave, higher wages, obviously, better schools that can actually take care and make sure that children become functioning adults. All of these things would aid families tremendously. So in terms of policies, these are all helpful. But the reason I'm not talking about policies is because I think, as the conversation has shown, there's an automatic rejection of the premise, which is, what is there good to the family? Like, why are we even talking about the family? What does the family mean? But as you said, well, the fact that we've ignored it and we've basically neglected the discussion entirely means we don't have a good conception. And so for me, part of putting this out there is to say, there is a good defense, a good egalitarian left-wing defense of the family. And I'm trying to make it. Now, those who want to say I'm wrong, go ahead, make the case that I'm wrong. But at least we can start to clarify what we mean by what a future society should look like, right? Should it be one with thriving, flourishing families, or is that a backward look? Is that something that looks fundamentally at the wrong way? I say no. I think a better society would be one with flourishing families. Other people disagree. They would rather be more individual, more autonomous. But my case for the future is to say we should embrace the family. We should bear hug it and say this is a good thing for society.
Yes, you back there.
Yeah, I wanted to ask kind of about like the horizons of the politics that we're talking about here, because
I want to ask about the horizons of the politics.
Horizons of the politics, right? Because this like abolition of the family, I think the way that Marxists would traditionally talk about this, and Catherine kind of said that, and I think one of the gentlemen up there would be that the family might perhaps wither away after the transformation of society, right? That we don't need to cling to this thing which capitalism is already disintegrating, right? You have
Okay,
like
we
we were
don't
talking
need
about,
to
you know,
cling to this thing that capitalism has already disintegrated. We can look at the horizon for the disappearance of the family and.
right. So the question is like why the insistence on the family? Like, is the working class too crippled by its daddy issues after growing up in like broken homes that we can't make the socialist revolution and perhaps realize new social forms which might be more egalitarian than family? Or might
So is
present
the
new
working class so
possibilities for the way that
crippled by
human
its
beings
daddy
interact?
issues that we need to revive the family? That just seems really condescending to me. I'm realizing, but that we need to revive it. Okay.
I mean, I guess what I would say is that the crises that we're facing are crises of, lonesomeness is a huge crisis that we're facing, right? Atomization is a huge crisis that we're facing. Anomie is a huge crisis that we're facing. Declining birth rates all over the world. And if you don't think that's a crisis, wait until you get Social Security, because the only way we have a social state is by young people paying for the care and sustenance of the old. So if you think birth rates are a right-wing fantasy and them like worrying about them is some patriarchal nonsense, if you don't understand how our social state functions, that's going to destroy all of our Social Security if we don't have any young people in the society paying for these things. Sure, maybe we can transcend these things. Maybe there'll be a great uprising of the working class against the rich, and somehow we are instilled with the virtues of solidarity strong enough to overthrow capitalism. I'm not buying it. I think instead what we should be thinking about is how do we rebuild the sociality of our contemporary society so that we can even imagine going beyond capitalism, right?
So rebuilding the family would be a precondition for reconstituting some kind of revolutionary movement.
In the same way that rebuilding mass parties, which no one thinks is a reactionary idea. Let's go back to the mass party. No one thinks that's a reactionary idea, even though it is looking backward at an older form. Rebuilding our unions. No one thinks that's a reactionary idea, even though it's looking backward at an older form of struggle. These are things that are fundamentally social institutions that I think, as they aggregate, we get better horizons socially. And we don't have them right now. We have a totally disintegrated social life.
I want to just add one thing, is that, and this is psychoanalytic, of course, there is still no institution that can replace this very flawed, biologically based, narcissistic institution that teaches us how to love each other. And however fucked up it is, however you love someone, is how you were loved. And if you are not loved, you will not be loved. You will not be able to be loved. And there's a terrible thing about the love and the irrationality of love that arises in the family as a crucible for the production of eros that keeps us together and that drives us apart. And it seems like, the left liberal, the trads, I idealize it, but the left liberals want to just trash this. Yeah. And you want to invent a new kind of love. And unfortunately, we're enslaved to the biological forms of love that are our, that is our mortal coil. So there's some irrationality to all of this that is why, the synthesis of Marxism and Freudianism for damage is still such an important thing. Just try to overcome love. Okay, I'm being told that our time is up. So one last question. Oh yes.
So I think I might be like.
Oh, you didn't say time was up? Okay, you're just like doing sign language to me. Oh, you were raising your hand. Oh, sorry. Okay. He's the man, he's the boss. So he's like, okay, sorry, you and then Ben.
So I think I might be like one of the youngest people here, and I know, like in my own, circle, like a lot of the reason why young women don't want to have children is they have I think a very doomer perspective of the future and stuff like that. So I guess
a lot of the reasons why young women don't want to have children is they have a doomer view of the future. Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, how can we, change that perspective without actually changing, the societal tangible change that I think a lot of people want.
How can we change that perspective without changing the society?
Well, I think we have to do both, right? I think that to a certain extent this goes to what Greg is talking about, right? Having children is an immediate connection to the future, right? It can't make you not think there is good, there is a future, there is a tomorrow, there is something better. So to a certain extent, I think that it's that doomer mentality is a self-defeating mentality, right? It says everything can only get worse and there's nothing that can be done to fix it. And the other thing I'll say, and this goes to your point about how narcissistic we all are, we are not living in the worst possible of our existence. And people have had families through much, much worse, much more difficult conditions than the conditions that we live under. And sometimes we look at that and we think, oh, that's normal, because they must have been stupid, or they must have been like out of their minds. But people had families during the plagues. People had families during the Great Wars.
I know,
People
so
had families
like kids, you feel doomorous. Like, imagine growing up in the 80s and thinking everything was going to blow up in a nuclear war. Like, that's how I grew up. Right? And I was like, and now it's even closer than ever. Like, they were fooling us then. It's actually going to happen now. Can I just say one thing? What do you think the life expectancy was in East Asia in 1900? Just name a number, young person.
In the 1900s?
1900. 1900.
Maybe 60?
It was 30. So you think you have it bad. In 1900, because of the GDP, the wars, the starvation, the infectious diseases, cholera, diphtheria, tuberculosis, and lack of food, and the Qing dynasty being so fucked up, the life expectancy was in 1900 was 30. So people died at 30. You think you have it bad now? Think about living in Hungary in 1100, right before Genghis Khan comes to get you. Actually, Genghis Khan made your life much better. He brutalized the people. But Europe was mired in a kind of subsistence farming with very little technology, and your only hope of salvation was to be dead and reborn. Right? So I feel like we have miseducated the youth. We have made you think that you have it harder than anyone else. The very fact that 500,000 years ago, there were only 50,000 Homo erectuses on this planet. Because and every time I think about this, I'm like, I'm amazed we even survived as Homo sapiens, that we even emerged. Because of the large predators, the diseases, the absolute brutality that our species had to survive. And children, having children, you're very young, the youth gives us optimism. If I were really narcissistic, I'd say, oh, I hope the world ends, so I'm the last generation. I want you to survive and thrive when I'm not here. The family, for better or worse, is a way of connecting me to that temporality. And narcissistically speaking, the greatest narcissist is the one who thinks the world ends when he or she dies. It won't end. There are 8 billion of us almost. It's a fucking miracle that we can see that we're not starving to death. So what did I say? Oh, Ben, you're next.
I just thought it would be helpful to tease out I'll just talk about what's ethical and what's political here. So Dustin, you just mentioned a suite of policies, pro-family policies, right? Jobs, education, etc. Why can't we just be for those? Why an additional explicit commitment to the family?
Well, I think the main reason why is that if we have, there's always an ethical vision behind any political choice, right? Anything that you're saying we're going to do, it is motivated by some ethical, grounding, right? So one question is, why is it that the Swedes, a good example of this is the Swedes and the Norwegians have very robust family policies, right? And I'm very jealous of them, wish that we had a Nordic social state in the United States. Yet, and people rightly say this, their birth rates are not much better, their family formation rates are not much better than the United States. So clearly just having social democratic policies doesn't automatically give family flourishing, right? And so the reason I think there needs to be an ethical commitment is many of the Swedish social democrats who are looking at this and saying well, why is this? Why is this? A sociologist named Catherine Liu, a feminist social democratic sociologist, basically came up with the very obvious reason. Family formation is a completely silent topic in family policy in Sweden and Norway. They do not talk about it. They never once say it's good to have a family, or we want you to have a family, or we want families to grow in Sweden. They never say it. And the reason they never say it is because they're a little bit skeptical of the very idea that there should be an ethical commitment to the family, that there should be a social commitment to the family, beyond the bare minimum of we're going to make it easier, if you so choose to have a family, we'll make it easier for you. And that silence on the ethical side is, I think, one reason why it's so difficult to have conversations about the family on the left. Because We have for so long essentially said, we want everybody to do whatever they want. We don't really want to have fights about what the normative goal is, but we do want the state to take care of everything, right? We want the state to help us out in all these ways. Well, if we don't have a real ethical commitment, that's going to look very different from very different perspectives, right? A clear example of this is should we prioritize fighting for expansive paternity and maternity leave, parental leave, or should we prioritize the socialization of daycares, right? And C.K. Rawlings in the current issue of Damage makes a very persuasive case that, in fact, expansive parental leave is a much better policy. But the way to make that case, you have to already start from the premise of thinking, maybe families need a lot of time together. Maybe they need a lot of time to be away from the market, away from work, in order to thrive. Well, you have to have an ethical commitment to that sort of understanding of family life to come to that realization. Otherwise, you'll say, well, the cheaper option and the more expedient option is daycare for all, right? And that's the one that we can do right now. From a political expedience point of view, why don't we just give this thing to everybody right now? It'll make people happy, it'll make people like us, but people then are still dependent on the market transactions being the predominant mode of family life, right? So I think why the ethical side of it needs to be discussed, and at least a case needs to be made. I can very well lose. I mean, I think on the left I probably will lose the debate, but I want to make the case, and I want the case to be heard that there is a common good in family life, and if we don't have that ethical commitment to it, I think we make a whole suite of policy decisions that are the wrong direction.
All right, so I'm going to go from you. 1, 2, 3. Okay, you.
Yeah. I want to go back to
really loud, please.
Sorry. Yeah. To go back to like one of the questions a little earlier from the question of political horizons. Right. I think that's actually really important here. Because,
I want to go back to the question of political horizons. Okay.
Yeah, and to be a good Marxist and connect the kind of like the social dimension that we're talking about to the material dimension. When you mentioned reindustrializing, like returning to the national industrial economy as a way to revitalize family life, I think that really gets at it, because I think the question really is like what are we talking about when we say socialism? Are we working with the same definition? Because I think what's unfortunate is that this debate within the left has gotten kind of sort of cliche polarized into either these like queer anarcho-liberals who just want to say we're going to abolish everything, abolish the family, abolish the state, abolish borders, and then this like, okay, we're the pragmatic adults, we're going to, return to the good like post-war social democracy and build strong unions in the working class. And I think on both sides there's a real failure to reckon with the actual change in material conditions, why we're not in the 50s anymore, why we're not in the industrial era, why you can't, and why that changed, and the idea that it sort of seems to be this shared assumption that there was just, people just decided to do the 60s culture war, people just decided to do neoliberalism, and it was just this idealistic change in ideology that we could just turn back, and then that's the only thing that's stopping us from, returning to this heyday of working class organization. So I think we really need to reckon with, are we actually trying to move beyond capital? Are we actually, what kind of world are we striving towards? And I guess there's kind of an assumption of a stagism that, we just need to return first to the 50s social democracy, and then we can maybe move beyond that. But I would kind of challenge that, like, what if that's not how it works?
Okay, I'm going to summarize. I don't know, it was so long, your question, but it doesn't mean that we're going to, what does it mean to really reindustrialize the economy? What are we really returning to a kind of social democracy to get to another point and entailing along the way a strong family? I'm just summarizing.
Yeah, I mean, I think your question sort of brings up, it's funny because I think it inverses that adage where, in the 2010s it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. But I feel like, at least in this room, it seems easier for you people to imagine the end of capitalism than to imagine that we could build things in America again. And I just don't believe that. I mean, I think it's much easier for us to rebuild an economy and an industrial base than it is for us to imagine a post-capitalist society. Now, why do I think we have to get back to that social democratic compact, and why do I think that makes sense? Well, again, as I said, there was a trajectory in a sort of Polanyian sense in which society defended itself against the market, right? That's what social democracy was. It was society defending itself against the market. And it succeeded to a large degree. It succeeded very well. It created robust societies that had actual flourishing human life for a very short period of time. And then the bosses woke up and they said, enough of this, we're not letting it happen anymore. We want to increase profitability, we want to do this. And they tore it all down, right? I think along the way, what many people on the left have done is basically forget that we did actually have a decent vision of how to get from an atomized, miserable, anomic society, which was the society of the 19-teens and 20s, into a society of sociability, associationalism, brotherhood, solidarity, fraternal organizations. We did this. We were here before. We did it. And the same debates were happening then, and many people said, no, this moment is going to happen, and we're going to jump straight into communism, right?
No, I think that or even space communism.
Oh, yeah. Even better.
Yeah, but, I mean, I think that for a lot of people in our hothouse world, like social democracy and the family are just not cool. That way. Okay,
Yeah. I would say, I don't know if this is a question as much of a reflection, but I feel like here we're getting this huge context collapse between the idea of promoting the family and being a parent specifically. And I think in some ways, like, I resent this idea that, like, to expand the family, that you have to have children. Like, I don't want kids, but I can still be part of a family. I can still be an aunt, I can still be a daughter, and I think too, and it doesn't make me have some automatic like knee-jerk reaction to right-wing policies or a narcissist. I'm just someone who has a lot of mental health issues who doesn't want to pass those on. You know, or other people maybe can't have kids, or other people want to adopt, or other people. There's just a number of different reasons there. So
Dustin said you had to have kids. I said you had to be the child of someone.
Right. To be the child, and not even necessarily biologically, right? Like, sure, we were all born by someone, but some of us are adopted too. So I just wanted to voice that I think we can support the family without just fetishizing parenthood specifically. We can create a bigger concept of family.
No, I mean, I think that's right. I didn't mean to insist that the only family unit is the family unit that I suggested, but people wanted me to get specific, and I think the biggest problems are, with...
I think we are all children of somebody, and that has fucked us up. And we need to work together and work through it. So if you want, that's my most inclusive statement. So 1, 2, and then 3 over here. 1 tall guy, and then woman in white in the back, and then you with the bangs in here. Okay.
So my question is much more like coming from a place of soulless reformism than some other questions that have been posed.
Soulless reformism? This question is coming from a place of soulless reformism.
So, like, I guess I'm wondering, like, there are some kinds of, like, we're talking about concrete policy measures. There are, like the sort of universalistic social democratic welfare state of Nordic countries might not be the best in terms of promoting families. It might not be better than the conservative welfare state structures of continental Europe, right? This is like a distinction made by somebody like Guastella Anderson. So these kinds of, like, for example, the birth rates in France are higher, but probably people have less, capacity to spend time with their children when they do have them, have less ability to flourish as families than in, these kinds of universalistic social democracies. So I guess I'm wondering, like, there are certain kinds of policies that do legislate morality that make benefits conditional on existing in certain kinds of family structures, right? On having, being married, whatever. And that these kinds of policies might be better for fostering family formation, but they also might not be overall more desirable. So I guess I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Milan, that's a really good point. And I think we're just at the beginning of really examining every social democrat in the world right now is looking at this, right? There is no social democratic party in the world that is not staring down the barrel and saying, in 30 years, if this keeps up, the entire edifice of our social state is gone, So which policies are most effective and best? I don't think anyone has the answers, I know, Orban thought that by giving everybody a ton of cash, they would all start breeding like rabbits, right? That didn't work out. Sweden and Norway had for a long time exceeded the expectations, and now they're falling behind. So if anybody has the answer for the ideal mix of family policies that creates a sort of stable social environment while also dealing with the replacement rate, that I think that party is going to get elected. That's effectively what I think. But so far we don't know.
So, you're number 2, yes.
My question is reflecting on a historical family and just the idea of family. How do we
Okay, I'm going to repeat this. My question is reflecting on the historical family.
Yeah, looking back on family and wanting these family values, how do we do this while keeping women in the public sphere?
How do we do this while still keeping women in the public sphere?
Right. I mean, this is why I think, expansive leave policies are extremely important. There was a story the other day in the paper, and this kind of demonstrates, I think, where certain liberals are on this, that a woman was in law school and she was about to give birth, and she, petitioned the professor to delay her exam, right? This very liberal elite university said, no, you can't delay your exam. You have to take your exam tomorrow, right? These are ways in which even the most liberal institutions in our society punish motherhood dramatically. They punish motherhood. It's a punishment in the labor market. It's a punishment. But if we say the result is the PMC result, which is, only an elect group of mothers should be able to get these benefits, then we're leaving the vast majority of mothers in the rift. So we have to figure out policies that effectively combat the punishment of motherhood in the labor market, such that people feel they can have kids and also have a public life, and they don't feel like having kids immediately consigns them to the privatism of the home.
So I also think that it's one of the stories that we've been told that domesticity prevents women from entering the public sphere, and there's been a history of women who participated in the public sphere because in their societies, caste and class trump gender. So that's why in certain countries that we think of as being very, very patriarchal, women like Indira Gandhi and Benazir Bhutto, by caste and class, surpassed gender and entered the public sphere. So I'm really interested in the class question more than I am the gender question these days. I mean, I am interested in women by class as well. And women who have the wherewithal to find childcare, to find the kinds of jobs that do accommodate them, they will have no problem at all. But it's the question of ordinary women that should preoccupy us, and they are the majority of women. I had another, oh yes, you.
Catherine, given your work in trauma studies, trauma culture, and all of that, what are your thoughts of parentification, presented as a form of trauma that is inflicted?
Parentification, did you say? Yes.
Presented as a form of trauma that's inflicted by the parent upon this child. To me, it feels like another one of those really off-putting ideas to present to working class people who are to engage in that.
What is parentification? I've never heard this.
The idea that a child is forced to take on adult roles, for example, taking care of a younger sibling.
Right.
This becomes a necessity.
And this is not good.
Yeah, there's entire culture around self-healing from parentification.
From parentification. So I have a whole thing on this in the book, but the original function of children in agricultural societies was as labor. Okay, so there's that. In the Industrial Revolution, in the first Industrial Revolution from the 1810s to the 1830s, the rate of industrialization was so quick, and the sunk cost factories were so expensive that no capitalist wanted his textile mill to be idle at any time. So basically the working class, the Irish working class, the English working class, worked 24 hours a day in shifts. And they had children, and the children were workers. Child labor has always been a part of diminishing, raising productivity. And so I actually have this thought, I didn't put it in the book, but I have this thought that children have a role to play in contributing to the well-being of the family. And they show that early model, giving children responsibility, come back to this, actually promotes better mental health care. And with the leisure-heavy model of the upper middle class, professional managerial class families, that this kind of dysregulation is actually producing a lot more anxiety and unhappiness in children who are given no responsibility at all. And the whole idea is just you guys play, go out and play sport, go out and play video games. Like I'm just a leisure bot. And this notion of childhood is actually very new, very bourgeois. So I'm not saying children should perform wage labor, but within the unit of the children, not the child labor like these Republicans, but within a family unit, like this parentification that we give to working class families that we call child abuse was actually a more traditional form of like interdependency. But thank you for that question. That's a good question. Okay, so I think we can take one last question and then we'll just mingle. So, it's you in the green because your green is so striking.
Thanks. So I understand the family, part of what makes it distinct is it's a last remaining arena of non-instrumental affection and kind of these irrational forms of affection, non-voluntary forms of affection that you talk about. And I just wanted to think about how you use those sorts of terms to combat the kind of neoconservative critique of social policy, which is to say, by the government introducing these forms of rationality, instrumentality into family life, you're actually undermining the very conditions that allow that to take place. So the sort of neoconservative critique of the Great Society, how do you kind of combat that critique that in terms that valorize the kind of rationality and non-voluntary?
Dustin's going to answer the question.
I mean, I think that, back in Dickens' time, for instance, they said that public schools were going to destroy the family, right? The advent of public schools was ripping children from the home and forcing them into an alien environment, and it's going to lead to the disintegration of families. The history is quite the opposite, right? Public schools actually enabled better and stronger family growth because they created better conditions for able children, right? And as public schools grew, now today, I'm sure there are many conservatives in the homeschooling movement who still believe this idea. But for the most part, people have come to understand that public provisions of certain social goods do not necessarily threaten family life, right? And I think the same way about a lot of policies that we would consider pro-family, in that we have to make the case that these things are not going to destroy family life or socialize aspects of family life such that there is no spontaneity, there is no love, there is none of these things. But we need to show that throughout history we've seen these steps in progress, and some of them have resulted in greater, stronger, better family life. Others have resulted in the dissolution of family life. We have to make sense of those things and figure out which policies actually work.
I want to add something else to that, which is that there's a fantasy in this neo-libertarian trad family that the family is pure and that the state and the outside influence is impure. That's a position of defensiveness that only creates problems. Like, that's a very fucked up family if you think that you can't be porous with regard to the outside world. And we live in an post-industrial democracy of interdependency. It makes me very sad for those people who think that they can be completely autarkic, psychically, economically. It never lasts. I mean, there's an article in The New Damage about the disillusionment of the trad family. Like, there's all this display about trad wives, and then they get burnt out and bored. And love doesn't mean anything if it's not a love that can be outside of the family, too.
Exactly.
We learn to love in the family, but we don't keep the love in the family. The love has to be translated outside of the family.
And in the same virtues that make family dependence valuable are those that make interdependence, social dependence valuable. And those families that have cut themselves and walled themselves off from the world are extremely brittle, and those ties become extremely easily broken, right? And we know all those stories about, people who grow up in cults or people who grow up in these sorts of organizations.
I was going to say that when in the 60s, when there was all that terrible turmoil, in the teens and 20s, another time of turmoil because of capitalism, people who rejected and tried to escape the family often found themselves in cults. And I feel like the trad thing is a cult. I'm involved in a cult called academia, but there's a kind of cultishness when you reject the authority of the family and you give it to someone else. That's like unprocessed neurosis. And this is, once again, I think, the tyranny of structurelessness, this great essay by Joe Feeman, is that when you have no structure and you have an illusion of equality, there's always a charismatic individual who emerges, who becomes a source of love and authority, and then everyone has to please them. I think this happens in polycules. Maybe that's just me. But there's like one guy, there's one person whose affections you really want. It's very hard to regulate this kind of amorphous, polymorphous perversity as adults. And I do think that this kind of cultishness, we see a cultishness in our allegedly liberal democracy now that I feel is part of like our real, true, collective psychic fucked upness. I'm not saying the family can heal it, but I do feel like the left should be able to preach something about love of each other, love of the things that we hold dear, love of the collective good, that can create a positive image for us of a collective future that is based on respect.
I agree.
What do you mean?
Just real quick, damagemag.com. If you're not already a subscriber, please do go to the website and sign up. We have 3 issues at the desk there. Please do buy those.
Dustin will sign some now.
And thank you to Catherine and Dustin for being our guests here.
And we're going to get kicked out of here.